Do you know which was the first Allied fighter to seriously challenge Japanese domination of the skies in the Pacific? Could it be the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the heavy fighter aircraft we're talking about in this video? The skies over North Africa churned with the drone of German engines. On the morning of April 5th, a vast armada of 50 to 70 Junkers Ju-52 transports lumbered across the sky, a vital lifeline for the beleaguered Africa course. Guarding them was a hornet's nest of over 30 escorts, a deadly mix of Messerschmitt Me-109s and Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. But from the blinding sun, a new predator appeared. A mere 26 Lockheed P-38 Lightnings plunged into their midst, their twin booms a terrifying silhouette against the azure canvas. The ensuing maelstrom saw the Lightnings tear through the formation, claiming 11 of the cumbersome transports and 4 other German aircraft in a furious exchange that cost them only 2 of their own. Days later, another P-38 formation tasked with shepherding B-25 Mitchell bombers on a wave-skimming attack on enemy shipping turned on their German pursuers and scythed 15 fighters from the air. Over the next week, the skies became a killing ground for the P-38s as they hunted down scores of German transports and dozens of fighters. This relentless pressure set a bloody stage for what would be forever known as the Palm Sunday Massacre. On that fateful day, Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks and Supermarine Spitfires, inspired by the P-38's success, unleashed a storm of fire upon another massive German transport fleet, claiming an astounding 100 aircraft from the sky. With that single brutal stroke, the aerial artery to the Africa Corps was severed, leaving Rommel's army to bleed out on the sands of North Africa. But this triumph in the south created a terrifying void in the north. The very P-38s that had turned the tide in Africa were desperately needed in England. Their diversion left American fighter strength critically depleted. By the spring of 1943, only a single U.S. fighter unit, the P-47 equipped 4th Fighter Group, stood guard. The plan to replace the Lightnings with the new brutish P-47 Thunderbolt was flawed. The heavy single-engine fighter was a powerful brawler, but it was thirsty, lacking the legs for the long, perilous journey into Germany's heartland. The P-38 was the only answer. New groups were hastily formed in the States, their pilots trained on the unique twin-boom fighter and rushed to England. Their unparalleled range meant they alone could cling to the bombers, their guardian angels, on the deep penetration raids that struck at the very industrial heart of the Third Reich. In a symbolic testament to their reach, it was the P-38 Lightning that became the first Allied fighter to scream through the skies over Berlin. The P-38's legendary versatility invited ever more audacious, ever more dangerous missions. None were more daring or more tragic than the attempt to repeat the infamous Operation Tidal Wave Raid against the oil fields of Ploiești, Romania. On June 10, 1944, this was not a mission for heavy bombers but for fighters. 36 P-38s, each burdened with a 1,000-pound bomb, thundered towards the target at treetop level, a fragile shield of 39 clean Lightnings flying escort above. They plunged into a cauldron of fire. The skies erupted as they entered the most heavily defended target in Europe, second only to Berlin itself. When the smoke cleared, 23 Lightnings and their crews were gone, swallowed by the relentless, deadly flak. While the Lightning carved its legend in Europe, a different war raged in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific. Here the P-38 was not just needed, it was desperately prayed for. American fighter squadrons thrown into the fray with Bell P-39 era Cobras and Curtiss P-40s were being systematically slaughtered. They were outclassed, outmaneuvered, and outgunned by the superior Japanese fighters that ruled the skies. When General George Churchill Kenney took command in the Southwest Pacific, he knew his pilots needed a miracle. He made a direct plea to General Henry Hawley Arnold, "Send me P-38s." But Kenney asked for more than just a machine. He asked for a specific man, and while impossibly gifted young lieutenant, he had once disciplined for brazen, unauthorized aerobatics. A pilot named Richard Ira Bong, who had dared to fly a P-38 in a loop-the-loop around the Golden Gate Bridge. Kenny saw not a troublemaker, but a killer instinct. A hunch that would prove prophetic, as Bong would go on to become America's ace of aces kung saan there was, claiming 40 enemy aircraft in the cockpit of a Lightning. But the miracle was slow to arrive. When the first P-38s finally reached Australia, teething problems and design flaws kept them grounded, delaying their combat debut and frustrating the eager pilots. Yet by the close of 1942, the issues were resolved. The Lightnings began to replace the outmatched P-39s of the 35th Fighter Group. The pilots of the 49th, still flying their weary P-40s, looked on with envy, knowing their turn would come soon. A new shadow was stretching across the skies of New Guinea. The Japanese were about to learn the name of the Fork-Tailed Devil. The P-38's path to victory in the Pacific began not with a roar, but with a bizarre, almost comical accident. For weeks, a simmering frustration had grown among the Lightning pilots. They prowled the skies, potent and untested, yet the Japanese seemed to vanish before them, deliberately avoiding the strange twin-boomed specter. The taunts began to crackle over the radios. Patrolling over the Japanese stronghold of Lae Airdrome, American pilots threw down verbal gauntlets, daring the enemy to fight. Finally, in late November, one Japanese pilot took the bait. As his fighter clawed into the air, a young P-38 pilot from New Orleans named Farrell plunged down to strike. In the heat of the dive, a sudden realization hit him: he was still carrying bombs. With his target lining up, he frantically jettisoned the deadly cargo, planning to swing around for a gun, run the moment the enemy's wheels were up. The bomb screamed down, missing the runway and erupting in the bay beyond. But fate had a cruel twist in store. The unfortunate Japanese pilot, focused on his takeoff, flew directly into the colossal geyser of seawater thrown skyward by the explosions. The wall of water shattered his aircraft, sending it spiraling into its watery tomb. The kill was so unorthodox that General Kenny, with a wry smile, initially kidded the young Cajun pilot. A medal had been promised for the first P-38 victory, but this wasn't a dogfight, it was a fluke. Kenny teased that Farrell didn't deserve it since he hadn't fired a single shot. But later that evening, the general walked into the squadron's quarters and, with the respect due to a warrior, pinned the air medal on the chest of the pilot who had drawn first, albeit accidental, blood. But a fluke victory could not win a war. The day the P-38 truly announced its arrival, the day the legend was forged in fire, was December 27, 1942. The stillness of a sweltering morning at Laloki Aerodrome was shattered by the frantic cry of an air raid warning. A massive Japanese formation was inbound for Port Moresby. On the dusty strip, 12 Lightning pilots scrambled into their cockpits. Leading them was Captain Thomas Joseph Lynch, an ace already bloodied in the cockpit of a P-39. He shoved the throttles forward and 12 P-38s clawed into the sky, climbing furiously to meet a swarm of 25 Japanese fighters and dive bombers. What followed was a slaughter. When the furious swirling melee ended, the sky was littered with falling wreckage. The American pilots claimed 15 enemy aircraft. Official histories would later confirm 9 fighters and 2 dive bombers destroyed. The Lightning had proven its lethality beyond all doubt. Lynch himself added 2 kills to his tally. Lieutenant Kenneth Sparks claimed the pair, and so did a quiet, cherubic-looking lieutenant named Richard Bong. Bong was a paradox. Kenny himself called him a cherub, but behind those innocent good looks lurked the soul of a predator. He was not a gifted marksman. His genius was in the air itself. He was an exceptional pilot who understood that the surest kill came not from a distance but from sheer terrifying aggression. His method was brutal and direct. He would pull in so close to his quarry that its cockpit filled his entire gun sight, and then he would unleash hell, putting the guns right in the cockpit. In that first chaotic battle, Bong was reportedly cut off from the formation, finding himself alone and surrounded by Japanese fighters. For any other pilot, it was a death sentence. For Bong, it was an opportunity. He simply shot 2 of them down and escaped the trap unscathed. It was the beginning of a legacy that would see him achieve all 40 of his aerial victories in a P-38, only to perish tragically at the war's end while testing the very jet fighter his own propeller-driven exploits had helped make obsolete. Across the theater, commanders were taking notice. In the South Pacific, General Millard Harmon constantly pressed his superiors, pleading with General Arnold for more P-38s. His theater was a meat grinder centered on the desperate struggle for a tiny island called Guadalcanal. The Marines had seized its vital airstrip Henderson Field and now clung to it with bloody fingernails. Japanese aircraft staged relentless raids attempting to bomb the American foothold into oblivion. Defending them were the valiant but outmatched Marine F-4F Wildcats and Army P-39s and P-400s. These fighters were tough, but they were simply no match for the nimble Japanese Zeros. They lacked the performance to meet the enemy on equal terms, forced to hold the line with sheer grit and courage. The situation was dire. In November 1942, recognizing the precarious balance, General Douglas MacArthur made a crucial decision. He ordered the temporary assignment of a flight of P-38s to Guadalcanal. On November 13th, 8 Lightnings from the 39th Fighter Squadron lifted off from New Guinea and flew directly to the embattled Henderson Field. For one critical week, they became the island's new guardians. Their arrival was a symbol, a beacon of hope. Just one day later, on November 14th, a massive air and naval battle erupted. The engagement would break the back of the Japanese Navy's attempt to resupply their troops on the island, sealing the campaign's final outcome. The P-38s had arrived just in time, the vanguard of a new power that would soon sweep the Japanese from the skies. God Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. In the first part of 1943, Headquarters Army Air Forces at last began releasing a limited number of P-38s for assignment to the Pacific to take the place of the performance-limited P-39s and P-40s. Once Guadalcanal was made secure, the South Pacific area of operations began formulating plans to move northward through the Solomon Islands. In March the 18th, Fighter Group relocated to the South Pacific from Hawaii and merged with the 347th Fighter Group, which was in the middle of transitioning from P-40s to Lightnings. Soon after their arrival at Henderson Field, pilots from the 18th teamed up with others from the veteran 347th for one of the most renowned missions of World War II. In early April, Allied codebreakers discovered that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan's foremost naval strategist and the mastermind of the air attacks on Pearl Harbor and Midway, would be flying on an inspection tour of Japanese installations in the South Pacific. American crypto analysts had pinpointed Yamamoto's exact itinerary, including the detail that he was scheduled to arrive at the airfield at Balale on the island of Bougainville at 0945 on April 18th. Unquestionably still smarting over the humiliation of the Japanese victory over the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, nearly a year and a half earlier, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Ernest Joseph King instructed Admiral William Halsey, commander of U.S. forces in and around Guadalcanal, to get Yamamoto. Halsey passed the directive to the new commander for Air Solomons, a naval officer, Admiral Mark Mitcher. Since the only Allied fighters in the theater with the ability to make the interception were P-38s, the order went to the Army. 8 pilots were selected from the 18th Fighter Group's 12th Fighter Squadron, 2 were picked from the 70th Fighter Squadron, and 8 more came from the 347th Group's 339th Fighter Squadron. Captain Thomas Lanphier of the 70th Fighter Squadron was designated to lead the 4 P-38s of the attack section. Major John Mitchell was in overall command of the operation and led the other 14 P-38s in the protective cover role. The 18-airplane formation departed from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal at 07:25 hours on the morning of the 18th and flew at wave-skimming altitude for more than 2 hours. As they approached the coast of Bougainville, the formation of P-38 spotted Admiral Yamamoto's entourage. The two Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers carrying the admiral and his staff attempted to flee while 6 Zeros tried to intercept the attack force. Captain Lanfear shot down 1 Zero, then engaged one of the Bettys and sent it crashing into the jungle in flames. Lieutenant Rex Barber shot down the other Betty. Lanfear was credited with shooting down Yamamoto, but a dispute erupted between him and Barber over who got Yamamoto that persisted for more than half a century. Irrespective of who shot down whom, the flight of P-38s shot down Yamamoto and killed him and most of his staff. The Navy Cross was bestowed upon Flight Leader Major Mitchell and to each of the 4 pilots in the attack section. In May 1943, the 475th Fighter Group was established in Australia and slated to become the first group in the Southwest Pacific to be equipped exclusively with P-38s. At this time, other groups were operating mixed assortments of aircraft including P-39s, P-40s and P-47s as well as P-38s. Pilots and other personnel were drawn from other groups already fighting in New Guinea and sent back to Australia to form a corps around which the group would be built. Further personnel arrived from the States to fill out the squadron while new airplanes were transported by boat. By July, 118 P-38s had arrived in Australia and were undergoing the modification program at Eagle Farms to bring them up to combat standards. By mid-August, the group was prepared for combat and moved back up north to Dobodura to join the 49th Fighter Group, which was operating P-38s and P-40s. Range was one of the primary challenges facing the fighter commanders of the 5th and 13th Air Forces. In contrast to the war in Europe, which was waged over a relatively confined area and mostly over land, the war in the Pacific theater was fought over vast distances that necessitated long flights over water. The twin engines of the P-8 made it the perfect candidate for overwater flying. With a single-engine fighter, an engine failure signified that the airplane was doomed to fall from the sky. A twin-engine fighter or light, medium bomber could lose one engine and still manage to return to base. Charles Lindbergh. General Kenny and his fighter leaders deliberated over the challenges of their operational area and were continually devising new methods to increase the reach of their combat squadrons. While extended-range fuel tanks provided some increased range, in the summer of 1944, a veritable boon arrived in the theater, a man who would dramatically boost the range and combat radius of the P-38. In the spring of 1927, Charles Augustus Lindbergh single-handedly shattered the boundaries of aviation when he flew the Spirit of St. Louis, a single-engine Ryan monoplane he had a hand in designing across the Atlantic from New York to Paris. Following this legendary journey, Lindbergh, who was a qualified fighter pilot and an Army Reserve reservist, persisted in undertaking very long-range flights on occasion, joined by his wife Anne. Despite holding the rank of colonel in the Army Reserve, Lindbergh had relinquished his commission to assume a leading position in the American Isolationist movement. Having resided for several years in Europe, during which he visited with the air forces and flew the top fighters of many European nations, Lindbergh was staunchly against American involvement in the war. Lindbergh's isolationist stance vexed many influential members of the Roosevelt administration, and when he sought to return to active duty after the Pearl Harbor attacks, his application was rejected by President Franklin Roosevelt, who remarked to his staff, "I have clipped the wings of the lone eagle." Although he was barred from returning to the military, Lindbergh nonetheless made significant contributions to the American war effort, first as a consultant with Ford Motor Company, helping to resolve the issues of their contract production of Consolidated Liberator bombers and transports, then with United Aircraft, notably with the F-4U Corsair program. Lindbergh journeyed to the South Pacific as a civilian technical advisor for United Aircraft assigned to the Marine F-4U Corsair program, but he had not been in the area long before he grew connected with the P-38. Lindbergh was in the Pacific on U.S. Navy orders, but one of his personal missions was to conduct a comparison of the single and twin-engine fighters in combat, so he secured orders allowing him to go to New Guinea. When he arrived there, he went to General Whitehead and presented him a copy of his orders. He was told to join the 475th Fighter Group. Somehow, word of his arrival failed to reach General Kenny's headquarters until after he had flown a number of missions. When he found out that Lindbergh was in his theater and flying combat missions in P-38s, Kenny invited the famous aviator down to Brisbane. When Lindbergh arrived in Australia, Kenny took him in to see General Douglas MacArthur, telling his boss that he had an important job for Lindbergh. MacArthur authorized Lindbergh to work for Kenny, who immediately sent the Lone Eagle back to New Guinea to teach the young fighter pilots how to get more range out of their aircraft. Lindbergh's answer to the problem was quite simple. The Army pilots and Marine pilots flying F-4Us who also benefited from his instruction had been instructed to fly their aircraft at high propeller revolutions per minute and high manifold pressure, which allows maximum power from a turbocharged engine. Lindbergh told them to continue to fly at high manifold pressure but to lower propeller revolutions per minute, a technique that dramatically reduces fuel consumption while allowing high power from the engines. The Army pilots thought such a technique would burn up their engines, but Lindbergh assured them that this was not the case. Kenny had authorized Lindbergh to fly combat missions on the condition that he not participate in the fighter escort missions against the most heavily defended Japanese targets. Soon Lindbergh was flying and teaching Army pilots to fly missions that had previously been far beyond the published range of the P-38. Lindbergh's time with the P-38s in the Southwest Pacific came to an end after he in fact became involved in a dogfight with Japanese fighters and was credited with shooting down a Sophie, a Japanese float plane fighter. A second aerial combat a few days later found Lindbergh with the Zeke on his tail and several others getting ready to overwhelm him. Luckily, Lindbergh was in the company of a trio of experienced fighter pilots, and they quickly broke up the fight and rescued Lindbergh from a dire situation. When Kenny learned about the aerial conflict, he gave the order for Lindbergh to be prevented from flying. Lindbergh traveled back to the United States to fly with the Marines on a few more flights, and when he finally arrived back, he had approximately 50 combat missions under his belt and one Japanese airplane to his credit. However, he had left the fighter commanders in the Pacific with a gift that was irreplaceable: the capacity to significantly improve the range of their aircraft as a result of his actions. A P-38 formation had performed an unprecedented 280-mile trip on July 27th when Lindbergh was still flying with the 8th and 475th Fighter Groups. The operation involved escorting B-24s that were striking Japanese positions in the Halmahara Islands, which are located northwest of New Guinea. A mission of this nature would have been impossible if Lindbergh had not provided the necessary guidelines. It was the P-38 pilots of the 5th and 13th Air Forces who were responsible for the increasing number of aces in the Air Force. Because of their greater range, particularly after Lindbergh had extended their effective fighting radius, the P-38s were able to travel deep into Japanese territory, which was the area where the likelihood of coming into contact with hostile aircraft was the highest. Tommy Lynch. Tom McGuire and Dick Bong were among the P-38 units that were lucky enough to have fighter pilots who were proficient in their craft and aggressive in their approach. Lynch was the most experienced of the group, having begun his military career by engaging in battle against the Japanese while piloting the Bell P-39 era Cobra, which was not functioning very well. A short time after Bong's arrival in the theater in 1942, he and Bong became good friends, and the two eventually formed a partnership among themselves. Ideal Reconnaissance aircraft. Because of its extensive range and the presence of twin engines, the P-38 was the aircraft of choice for the Far East Air Force's fleet. When General Arnold informed Kenny that manufacturing of P-38s was going to be suspended in favor of manufacture of P-51s, Kenny responded by stating that he did not require any more P-51s and insisted that he desired more P-38s instead. Kenny told General William Knudsen, who had previously served as the president of General Motors, that the reasons he had provided for requesting P-38s in September 1943 were still valid. Knudsen gave Kenny his word that the production of the P-38 would not be prevented, By the time the war was over, the guns of P-38s had been responsible for the destruction of more than 10,000 Japanese aircraft. During the time when the fighter version of the Lightning was engaged in combat with the Japanese and German air forces, the photographic reconnaissance model of the airplane was also performing an especially important job. Army maintenance depots began converting P-38s into F-4 photo reconnaissance aircraft during the early stages of the war. This was accomplished by removing the weapons from the nose of the aircraft and replacing them with cameras. Model of the Lightning reconnaissance aircraft that was manufactured in a factory was given the name of F-5. Investigation of photographs. Lightnings played an important role in both Europe and the Pacific. In point of fact, the first P-38s to engage in combat in the Pacific theater were modified reconnaissance planes that were sent to Australia at the beginning of 1942. The upgraded P-51 Mustang made its first appearance in the European theater of operations at the beginning of 1944. Because of the huge increase in the airplane's range that was brought about by the installation of larger fuel tanks in the wings and fuselage, the P-51 quickly became the preferred fighter aircraft in Europe. This, however, was not the situation in the Pacific, where the P-38 continued to maintain its dominance right up until the day of the VJ Convention. Therefore, the image that typically comes to mind when we think of the best American fighter of World War II is the sleek and iconic P-51 Mustang, which is a legend that is celebrated at air shows all over the world. However, as we have demonstrated in this video, that is only a portion of the narrative altogether. However, the Mustang was a great airplane, but it arrived after the tide had already begun to shift. The reality is that the Mustang was a relative latecomer to the automobile industry. That huge mission of taking air superiority from the axis of clearing the route for triumph fell to two additional legends, the tough P-47 Thunderbolt and the star of our story, the twin-boom, twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Both of these aircraft performed tremendously well in their respective roles. The innovative vision of the design in 1937, which was so advanced that the Army was uncertain that it could ever be produced, was followed by a delayed and troubled production process, which resulted in only a handful of the vehicles being ready for use when the war broke out. Before ultimately making its debut in combat, it was not over Europe, but rather in the rough and isolated skies of the Aleutians. This was due to the tremendous worth of the aircraft, which necessitated that it was initially reserved for defensive purposes in the motherland. It is also important to note that in the huge Pacific theater, it continued to be the chosen fighter and the weapon of choice for the top aces of the United States right up until the day of VJ. It is possible that the Mustang is the most well-known automobile, but the P-38 Lightning, also known as the Fork-tailed Devil, was the vehicle that truly broke new ground. The fighter was the one who arrived first, paving the way for triumph at a time when the outcome of the war was still very much up in the air. Your time has been appreciated, and I hope to see you in the next video.